On a winter morning in 1902, a crowd of nearly 10,000 people pressed against the police lines in Paris. They had come to watch a locksmith open a single iron safe. For 20 years, that safe had been the most famous object in France, said to hold 100 million francs in American bonds. Bankers had lent against it. Newspapers had argued over it. Ministers had defended it. When the lid finally rose, the men leaning in saw an old newspaper, a single trouser button, and one foreign coin. The fortune of the century had never existed. She was born Thérèse d'Aurignac in 1856 in the village of Ausson near Toulouse, the daughter of a man who told tall tales about hidden noble estates. From childhood, she had a gift that money cannot buy. People believed her. As a young woman, she let it be known that a locked chest in the family home held proof of a vast inheritance, and that she would one day be rich beyond counting. Neighbors lent her small sums against the promise. It was a rehearsal. The chest at home was the first version of a story she would one day tell to the largest banks in France. Marriage carried her into respectability. She wed Frédéric Humbert, whose father Gustave Humbert was a senator, a jurist, and later the Justice Minister of France. The name opened doors that her village accent had kept closed. The couple settled in Paris in a grand house on the Avenue de la Grande Armée and lived on a scale that demanded explanation. Thérèse supplied one. She was, she said, the heir to a great American fortune, and the documents that proved it were resting in her safe. A family tied to the highest law officer in the country was not a family that strangers questioned lightly. The story she told was a small masterpiece of timing. In 1879, she said, she had been traveling by train when she heard groaning from the next compartment. Climbing along the outside of the moving carriage, she reached a dying American named Robert Henry Crawford and revived him with smelling salts. He swore to repay the kindness. 2 years later, in 1881, a letter arrived announcing that Crawford had died and named her in his will. There was no Robert Henry Crawford. There was no train rescue. But the tale was vivid, generous, and almost impossible to disprove, and that was exactly its strength. The genius of the scheme was the lawsuit. Thérèse claimed that Crawford had 2 American nephews who were contesting the will, and that the disputed fortune, the bonds themselves, had to stay sealed inside her safe until the courts ruled. So long as the case dragged on, no one could ask to see the money, because the money was legally frozen. To keep the fiction alive, 2 of her own brothers posed as the Crawford nephews, appearing with feigned American accents to argue the other side. She was, in effect, suing herself, and using the trial as a reason never to open the safe. With the bonds untouchable but visible on paper, the Humberts borrowed. They went to financiers, to provincial notaries, to ordinary savers, offering generous interest and the certainty of repayment once the great case was won. The collateral was always the same sealed safe and its supposed contents. Money flowed in for 2 decades, and the family spent it lavishly, on banquets, on dresses, on flowers carried by the cartload. Estimates of the total they raised against the empty safe reach as high as 100 million francs, an almost unimaginable sum, lent on nothing more solid than a story and a locked iron door. To feed the appetite for cash, Thérèse built an institution of her own, a life annuity company she called the Rente Viagère. Savers handed over their capital in exchange for the promise of a steady income, and their money helped service the older debts and buy time. It was a structure that depended entirely on new deposits arriving faster than old promises came due. Around it gathered a Paris of marble salons and good dinners, a household that looked exactly like real wealth. Beneath the surface, the whole edifice rested on the same hollow center, the safe that no one was permitted to open. Not everyone believed. As early as 1883, the newspaper Le Matin printed a skeptical article, questioning whether the American fortune was real at all. But Gustave Humbert was justice minister, and the weight of his office quietly steadied the story. Later, a watchful bank official, Jules Bazat, studied the family's finances and grew convinced that the bonds were a fiction, that the numbers simply could not be true. Doubt accumulated slowly, like dust on the lid of the safe. For years, it was not enough. A family protected by a great name and a pending lawsuit could outlast a great many questions. By 1901, the structure could no longer carry its own weight. Creditors who had waited years for the lawsuit to resolve lost patience and went to court. In 1902, a Paris tribunal ordered the famous safe to be opened so that the bonds inside could be counted and the truth settled once and for all. The press seized the moment. Le Matin had long demanded exactly this. The opening became a public spectacle, an entire nation gathering to watch a piece of furniture reveal whether 20 years of French finance had been built on treasure or on air. The Humberts did not wait for the verdict. Days before the safe was forced, the family slipped out of Paris and out of France, leaving the empty iron box to speak for them. When the lid finally rose before the assembled crowd, the contents were exactly what the doubters had feared, and the believers had refused to imagine. No bonds. No fortune. An old newspaper, a single button, a worthless coin. In a single moment, the 100 million francs evaporated, and thousands of lenders understood at once that there had never been anything to lend against. The hunt was brief. In December 1902, the family was traced to Madrid, living quietly under the noise of a foreign city, and arrested there by Spanish police. Brought back across the border, Thérèse and her relatives were paraded before a fascinated public and the cameras of the illustrated press. The woman who had been the richest heir in France was now its most notorious prisoner. The story that had carried her into marble salons now carried her, under guard, toward a courtroom where she would at last have to explain the safe that held nothing. The trial opened in 1903 and gripped the country. Thérèse, defended by the celebrated advocate Henri Robert, never fully abandoned her tale, insisting to the end that powerful interests had hidden the truth. The court was unmoved. She and her husband Frédéric were each sentenced to 5 years of hard labor. Her 2 brothers, the men who had played the Crawford nephews with their borrowed accents, received shorter terms of 2 and 3 years. Members of the family judged to have been deceived rather than complicit were spared. The verdict closed the largest swindle France had ever seen. What lingers is not the size of the fortune, but the shape of the lie. Thérèse Humbert never had to produce a single bond. She only had to make people want to believe in one, and then give them a reason to keep waiting. The lawsuit that never ended, the relatives who played their parts, the great name that vouched for her, all of it pointed attention away from the simplest test of all. For 20 years, no one insisted on opening the safe. The most expensive object in France was empty, and its real contents were the patience and the hope of everyone who leant against it.